Every town has its haunted corner, and in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, that place is the Convent of Jesus and Mary. I'll take you through its fascinating history tonight, the ghost stories that linger in its halls, and even share my own experience from the bishop's residence next door. This one's been on my paranormal bucket list for years, and it did not disappoint. Good evening, and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark. I'm your host, K.D. Culpa, a horror author and paranormal researcher based in Regina, Saskatchewan. Each week on the podcast, we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan's past and even go beyond, uncovering dark history, mysteries, urban legends, and sometimes we even get to some monsters. If you're one of the listeners that comes back each week but aren't yet subscribed, please hit that follow button and share it with someone who loves the weird and wonderful. I've got more big guests and haunted deep dives coming your way, so join me now as we explore the unknown and bring life to the ghosts and monsters hiding in the dark. Welcome to another local Saskatchewan haunt, where we explore the haunted corners of Saskatchewan. Tonight, I wanted to share a location with you that I personally visited this summer and had a blast wandering through its history. We are going to be traveling to Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, more specifically to the Convent of Jesus and Mary. This has been a haunted site that's been on my bucket list for so many years and is one of the reasons why I learned about Gravelbourg in the first place. So, first, let's talk a bit about the history behind the convent, and then we'll get into the ghost stories that I was able to dig up. Maybe I'll even share one of my own at the end, which didn't actually happen right in the convent itself, but in the historic bishop's bed and breakfast that we stayed in for 2 nights, which is right beside the convent and kind of part of, the church's buildings. All right. So the convent of Jesus and Mary would not have become to be without the religious community known as the Sisters of Jesus and Mary, which that community itself actually began back in France in 1816, so over 200 years ago. They would eventually expand over to Quebec, where they would build their first Canadian foundation in 1855, so right in Quebec. Now, you might be asking, how did they end up coming to a small community known as Gravelbourg in the middle of Saskatchewan's farming areas? Well, that had to do with the founder of Gravelbourg himself, which was Father Louis Pierre Gravel. He decided he wanted to bring the sisters and their community to Gravelbourg. So if you don't know the history of Gravelbourg, which I didn't know very much about it until I actually arrived there in early August this year, it has a Francophone heritage and has been referred to as a touch of Europe on the prairies. So Father Gravel, or Father Gravel, apparently had come to Canada through Quebec via New York City, and his aspiration was to create a French settlement in Saskatchewan to attract French settlers to the area and establish a community for the French language and Catholic faith, which is why there's lots of church stuff there. He ended up founding the settlement that became Gravelbourg back in 1907, after the area was already being used by various other groups and communities starting in 1906. So it was already kind of started as a farming community, but he decided he was going to officially make it this Gravelbourg. And then it officially became a town in 1917. Apparently, it was a really popular area in those early years, as the RM of Gravelbourg was recorded as the most populated RM in Saskatchewan back in 1928. So I'm assuming it must have been a really popular place to go and live if, in order to get that kind of a title. Now, getting back to the convent itself. As I mentioned earlier, Father Louis Pierre Gravel wanted the order to come to Gravelbourg, so the sisters, to be teachers in the area. And the whole point was they wanted to attract even more French settlers to Gravelbourg. So in 1915, 5 sisters would finally arrive in Gravelbourg, and this was led by Mother Saint Emilienne. They would be the first contingent in Western Canada for the order, And Mother Saint Emilienne had a background in teaching and administration already. Apparently, she had experience while being in Fall River, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, and even in New York City. So she had already been to many of these kinds of convents or schools, I think either as a helper, and I think in one she even actually led one for a bit. So lots of experience. Now, at first, before the convent was built, the sisters would actually start teaching out of a small chapel in the area that was known as the Maison Blanche at the time. Once the school was there, though, the demand for a boarding school for girls only increased, leading to the planning and construction of the convent, which started in 1916. Now, apparently, the convent started out as exactly, as it said it was going to once it was completed in 1918. A boarding school opened for the girls. The building itself had been constructed of clay bank brick and Tyndall stone. Actually, the brick was kind of interesting because this is part of our tour. It was also mentioned as part of our tour for the cathedral in Gravelbourg while we were there. If you don't know, there is the Convent of Jesus and Mary on the southern border of Gravelbourg. To the east of that is the historic Bishop's House where we stayed, the bed and breakfast that we stayed in, and highly recommend it. And then to the east of that is the Our Lady of the Assumption Co-Cathedral. So they have these like three buildings. So there's the sisters had the convent, the bishop had the historic bishop's residence, and then they had the cathedral. Now the clay bake brick is also like the plant itself is also a place on my bucket list to check out. Apparently the brick was brought in on the train to Gravelbourg to help build all the significant church buildings. It says other buildings were also built, but I didn't write them down. All three of these buildings I just mentioned use the clay brick though. So the cathedral, the historic bishop's residence, and the convent all had this brick. So what's interesting about this plant is it operated from 1914 to 1989 in Claybank, Saskatchewan, hence the name. The brick would end up in a lot of buildings across Canada, especially across Saskatchewan. So many historic buildings that I love to visit tend to have some of this brick, which is really cool. Hence the reason I'm hoping to actually visit the plant someday, because I think it's still open, at least in the summertime, maybe. I don't know. Let me know if you've been there and if you recommend it. Now, it had such an impact in buildings across Saskatchewan history. I think it would just be fascinating to see the origin place of the brick. Now, of course, the Tyndall stone is also similar. The convent also has that Tyndall stone, which many locations across Saskatchewan, especially the historical locations across Canada, tend to have those. I think that's something popular even across Canada. Now, back to the convent itself. So the sisters moved into their new convent by August 1918, just in time for the school to open up for the first classes in September. So in that first year, they actually had 80 boarders, so 80 girls being boarded, and 175 students enrolled into the school. And it didn't look like enrollments were going to slow down anytime soon. And since the sisters had traveled across North America to do their own studies, so both in the US and in Canada, they were able to bring a vast education to Gravelbourg, including classes in music, drama, arts, and the sciences. Apparently, the fourth floor of the convent was originally even a music studio with 8 sound-insulated cubicles. Then, in 1926, it was decided that they needed more room for the convent, so 2 wings were added. Now, one of these wings is actually the ones that I was able to visit while I was in Gravelbourg, which was the chapel on the north side of the building. And underneath the chapel, or so I was told, is a giant auditorium. Now, the south side, which is where the second wing was added, had apparently been used for high school departments, dormitories, dining rooms, and study halls. Now, unfortunately for the sisters, the 1920s also brought changes to the Saskatchewan laws, as that is the time when it became prohibited to have religious emblems and teachings in public schools. So the sisters had to change what they were wearing and parts of what they were teaching to accommodate these laws. Then, in 1926, when the Depression hit, the school board began to struggle financially. They had apparently told the sisters that they would be unable to pay teacher salaries at that time. But the sisters decided to keep the school open anyways. They gave up their salaries and instead started accepting promissory notes or bartered goods for tuition. Now imagine that. Your parents having to give away one of your cows just so that you could go to school for the year. I can't even begin to imagine what that would have been like at all. That just sounds so, I don't know, strange, but that's just what the time was, I guess. Eventually, Mother Saint Emilion would retire in the 1940s, and eventually a new mother, Saint Rodrigue, would take over the school. Now, by 1964, attendance at the school grew a lot, with 697 students enrolled in the school, leading to the construction of a much-needed high school building that is now on the north side of the lot. So they got a newer school. Finally, in 1970, the sisters sold the convent to the Gravelbourg School Board to take over, although they never gave up teaching the catechism. Apparently, instead of teaching at the public school, where you're not allowed to talk about the religious stuff, they took over the former home of Judge Alphonse Gravel to teach out of until December 2000, when they would stop teaching because, not because they didn't want to, but because the sisters had all gotten a lot older. The order wasn't sending anyone new, so they just kind of shut down doing it. The convent itself would continue being the Gravelbourg Elementary School until 2015. Although apparently the fourth floor, with all the music studios and dormitories, were sealed off during this time, so they weren't allowed to go up there. Since they weren't actually needed for the elementary school, they used all the classrooms and stuff in the first three floors. Now, the elementary school would then move on to a new building in 2016, leaving the convent empty again. And the town of Gravelbourg would take over ownership at that time from the school board. So during the time that the town has been in charge of the building, the first floor has been used as a community space for hosting artists and nonprofits or even small businesses. The chapel could be rented out for events, and we were told by our tour guide of the chapel that they would host things like teas in the chapel, like a Mother's Day tea, or little small markets, so like farmers markets. But they also allowed weddings and other things they allowed the chapel to be rented for. I think actually they could also rent out at that time, they could still rent out the auditorium as well underneath. So more recently than that, they just about turned the convent into a seniors living home. But unfortunately, the pandemic would hit, and the funds required to actually create the seniors home were just too expensive to make it happen. So this has led to the remaining tenants in the building to eventually be evicted and the building closed due to the high maintenance costs. So while we were touring, they said even to keep the chapel open, so on the northern wing, and available for renting would cost something like $10,000 a month. I guess it's because the boiler system is on the south side of the or of the building. So the heat would have to go through the south side, through the convent, and into the chapel in order to keep the chapel warm in the winter. So that's why it costs $10,000 a month. So that crazy heating cost is why the doors were closed in 2023, and the building has been left vacant ever since without heat or water or sewer. So this is causing some of the plaster to deteriorate because, there's no longer a steady temperature keeping it up, and there's no longer people in the building keeping it up, which is why they no longer allow people to even tour the building unless they're wearing hard hats and are insured to be on the premises. So we were told that the town would likely sell the building for $1 to anyone who can revive it and give it a purpose. So if you or anyone has deep pockets or a lot of funding that they don't know what to do with, then hey, go check out the convent in Gravelbourg. I wish I was a millionaire, as I definitely would buy a place like that if I could. I like thinking like artist retreats, writing retreats, oh, so many different things. Anyway. Actually, even our guide was talking about how great it would be to have like a culinary school, a French culinary school or something. That would be cool. Anyway, now, of course, with buildings like these, there are going to be lots of ghost stories and claims of paranormal experiences. I know that they've even allowed the odd paranormal investigator go through the building. So you know there will be something. Now, our guide that took us through the chapel said that she herself had two unusual experiences in the building, but that she felt that both had logical explanations. First of all, she was alone in there setting up for an event one night. I think she said it was for one of the teas. This would have been before they shut down the building in 2023. But she said while she was moving around chairs and getting things ready, she was alone in the building and she suddenly heard what sounded like nuns singing or praying or something. So she stopped and the sound stopped. Then she continued doing what she was doing, only for the singing to start up again. Now, her logical explanation for this one, which I'm not sure I'm convinced by, but she is that she eventually realized a pigeon was in the chapel with her up on the second floor. There's these railings on the second floor, and apparently there's a pigeon sitting there. So she's convinced that this pigeon was the cause of the sound. I don't know. I don't think a pigeon would sound like nuns singing and praying personally, but she's convinced that's all it was. Although she also told me that she refuses to believe in ghosts. So I don't know. I guess take from that story what you want to take from it. Especially since this is supposedly one of the unusual experiences that people have in the building, in the chapel itself, is that they hear the nuns reciting their prayers after dark, which would almost sound like a song, in my opinion. I don't know. So it does make you wonder if this was a pigeon, or if maybe she was actually hearing the ghostly echoes of the nuns reciting their prayers, and she just didn't want to believe that that's what she was hearing. Her second experience is definitely eerie, but I'll let her have her logical explanation because it does kind of make sense. So at the time when this happened, they were still allowing people to rent out the dormitories for writing retreats or artist retreats or things like that. And apparently one night she saw a light on in the chapel when there shouldn't have been. So she drove over to the chapel to open it up and turn off the light, except once she got there, the light was off. The couple that were staying in the building came and talked to her, saying that they thought they heard movement around in the chapel, but they couldn't see anything out of place. Then, when she got a call from the couple shortly after she returned, they had said the front door of the convent had been propped open, but they hadn't been the one to do that, and they were the only ones staying there at the time. So she returned again, this time with the police, and they found what looked like footprints and dragging marks in the upper floors of the chapel. She said it looked like someone had been inside and had crawled under an area to get into the convent from the chapel, because there are a few areas where you can get into back and forth. Most of them, I think, are locked, but this one must have not have been locked at the time. And anyway, apparently a car had also been seen leaving the area. So although it was spooky for these lights to be going off and, weird noises that no one knows what's making them, it was likely made by an intruder and not of the ghostly kind, which makes it less fun. However, if you go back into old videos that were taken when Gravelbourg Convent was closing, so I think it was Global Canada did an interview at that time. Anyway, there are teachers talking about unusual experiences in the building while it was a school. So one teacher said that she and her entire class actually saw a boy walk into the auditorium. Now, when they followed him in to let him know that they were going to be using the auditorium for their class, he was gone. The doors were locked, and the auditorium was empty. I guess it was also well known along the elementary school teachers to not be in the convent alone at night or on weekends. Some would only go if others would be around, or they would make friends or loved ones come be in the building with them. Or they might see shadow figures or hear doors slam while they were in there after the sun went down. That's the one thing that kept coming up was it was always after the sun went down, the feeling in the building changed, it shifted, and it kind of became alive. Now, one of the other claims that you'll also find on the internet is of a young woman that supposedly haunts the building. Claims go on to say that she would sometimes appear in the classroom as an extra person, only to later vanish. The story goes on to say that she was a young woman that went against her family's wishes, sneaking out in the middle of the night to make her way to Gravelbourg, because she wanted to become a nun and her family didn't want her to. The tragic side of the story is that when she finally arrived to the convent, she had become sick. I've read it could have been tuberculosis or some say Spanish flu because that was kind of around the time of the Spanish flu, as they say that this happened in 1918. Now, I couldn't find any proof of this young woman that had shown up at their door wanting to become a nun against her family's wishes. I did find, however, that there were quite a few deaths, well, several deaths, in the area of Gravelbourg around that 1918 time, probably because of the Spanish flu pandemic, and likely some of them were students at the school, which could explain the haunting, just from a different angle than what the story is going around. For example, there were the three Boutin sisters. I am so hard at these French names. I'm sorry, even though I have French background. Anyway, these sisters all died in 1918, so around that Spanish flu time, and are all buried together in the Our Lady of the Assumption Cemetery. One of them was around that 16 or 17 years old when she died, as they didn't say the exact month, so she's somewhere around 16 or 17 from what I can tell. And so that would kind of fit the description of the ghostly coughing girl in the stories for the classrooms because they say she's kind of around that age. Now her sisters were 6 and 13 years old. So they too might have been going to the school at that time. The Spanish flu was a hard time for many people across Canada. So it's not surprising that it might have caused some tragic deaths in Gravelbourg at that time. And those three sisters weren't the only deaths, according to the cemetery records that I found. There were a few girls around 16 years old that died that same year, likely due to Spanish flu again, and were likely students of the convent. So it's possible that the ghost of the girl still attending the school and coughing might actually just be one of these girls that had family in the area and were unfortunate to catch the Spanish flu during that time. Although for me, there's something about those three sisters. I don't know. Call it a gut feeling, but I'd be really curious about saying their names in the convent at night to see if the girl that supposedly haunts the building would come to one of their names or respond to one of their names, or if activity would pick up from one of their names. I don't know. I'd be curious. Anyway. Now, what's interesting is she is often seen on the fourth floor, or so the story goes, but that floor, as we talked about above, has been locked to the public for many years since the elementary school didn't use it. So it makes you wonder how many people really saw her walking down the halls up there if no one was supposed to be up there to begin with since the 1970s. Now, I mean, maybe unless it was in the 1960s they saw her because she would have passed in the 1918 time. But anyway, the claim goes that even though it was locked off, noises, slamming doors, items crashing to the floor, and someone running up and down the hallway could be heard from the third floor, making some of them wonder if there were ghosts that moved kind of into that fourth floor while the elementary school was active in the building. Although I wonder what the ghosts would be up to now that no one is in the building, that it's completely empty and all to themselves and just sits locked all the time. Makes you kind of wonder if something else is going on in there. I don't know. What do you think? Have any of you listening ever visited the Convent of Jesus and Mary? I'd love to know if you've had experiences or kind of what your feelings were if you have been in the building. I know we had one of our own experiences. Like I said, it wasn't in the convent itself. It was in the historic bishop's residence right next door, where we kind of overlooked the convent across the field from us. So while we were there, we were staying in the upper floor, which is the third floor, I think. And my poor husband, he doesn't like coming to these things with me. So he was sitting in the living room with the boys, and I was actually sitting in the bedroom. And while we were in there, um, my youngest had just come out of the bathroom because he had used the washroom. And as he was coming out, the shower in the bathroom turned itself on and then turned itself off, just like a really quick turn on, turn off. And my husband just happened to be sitting there when this happened. And so he was quite surprised by it, came and like went inside to make sure that it was fully off, found it was fully off, then came and got me because he's like, okay, your ghosts are coming out and bugging us. So I don't know. Now, that part didn't bother me. The shower doesn't faze me. What bugged me was in the middle of the night, I would constantly hear footsteps and shaking of like doorknobs. So I kept thinking someone was trying to come into the rooms where we were staying. So it would wake me up. We'd go look out into the main little area, nobody there. So we'd go back to bed. So then we thought, well, maybe the kids are trying to get up. So then we would go check on them. Nope, they're sleeping. Go back to bed. So I didn't get the most restful of sleep while I was there, but it's a very nice place, very clean, very comfortable. So I do highly recommend it if you ever decide to go hang out in Gravelbourg. But I don't know. One of these times I'm going to remember to actually take a camera with me and like equipment because I always forget to take a camera and equipment, and that is always when these things happen. One of these days, I will remember to set up a camera for overnight so that if, we hear these things, we can at least check them in the morning to see if, one, if it was a real person walking around trying to get in, or two, if it was actually a ghost and things were moving around and we just didn't know about it. Anyway, one of these days, I promise. Either way, I wish I could have walked to the halls of the convent alone that day, so when we checked out the chapel, because I would have loved to go in. I only got to kind of look through the glass doors from the chapel into the hallways. I couldn't go in. But maybe one day someone will buy the building and start to renovate it and will let me hang out in there for a few hours after the night falls so I can see if I can talk to the young girl and learn who she is and why she's still haunting the halls. Or if I can hear the nuns doing their prayers, kind of like a ghostly echo. I don't know. Until then, I suppose we'll never know. Thank you for listening to ParaGhoul Paranormal. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, then make sure you check out my local YQR Ghost Guide to learn more about the top ghosts and haunted buildings in Regina. Within the free download, you'll learn about who the most famous ghosts of Regina, Saskatchewan are, as well as some of the history behind the most haunted buildings. So head over to my website at kdkulpa.com to get your copy today. And before you go, I just want to say thank you for being here. Every listen, every share, every bit of support helps me take this podcast further. It allows me to interview bigger names in the horror and paranormal world, travel to more haunted places, and create more behind-the-scenes content just for you. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. I'll keep doing my part to make this show something special and spooky just for you. So stay tuned for more episodes where we uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and dive deeper into the shadows. This is Katie Culpa signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.